Hello and welcome to the Adventures of George Washington. I am your host, Professor Worthington. Today we will discover the unexplored connection between George Washington and the Wars of the Roses that happened in Great Britain during the 15th century. George Washington directly descended from a long line of social and political activists. As a teenager, he likely learned about the insurgencies, rebellions, and revolutions of his British ancestors through books such as A Chronicle of the Kings of England, From the Time of the Roman Government unto the Death of King James by English politician and historian Richard Baker, and A Complete History of England, From the Descent of Julius Caesar to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle by Scottish writer Tobias Smollett. Each of these books provided a different perspective on the conflict. Baker's narrative crackled with lurid details. He told of assassinations in all their gore and spoke of participants with colorful nicknames like Bluebeard and the Black Prince. It was a style guaranteed to mesmerize any colonial youth, as he often skewed the facts toward the sensational. Smollett, by contrast, delivered a sober, wide-ranging survey that deeply probed the causes, key players, and aftermath of the events. Whereas Baker stoked the imagination of the young and curious mind, Smollett supplied the strategic insight that an aspiring military and political leader would treasure. Taken together, these vivid chronicles of political violence helped shape Washington's convictions about when and why a people might justifiably rise up. Going back 9 generations in the Washington family tree, Robert Washington was a soldier and landowner from Lancashire County, England, during the period of time known as the Wars of the Roses. George probably did not know many specific details about his relatives living during this period, but he did know that they resided in the Lancashire area, and he knew that Robert Washington acquired much of his wealth as a knight in service to the Lancaster royal family. Thus, when reading the histories written by Baker and Smollett, George Washington would have visualized the roles his ancestors played in the events. The Wars of the Roses were a series of rebellions and civil wars, which lasted approximately from 1450 to 1509. The name derives from the royal symbols used by the two rival monarchies fighting for control of the English throne. The House of York was represented by a white rose and the House of Lancaster by a red rose. While both factions had supporters throughout the kingdom, Wales tended to be a refuge for the Yorks, and Lancashire generally supported the Lancasters. As an overview, the Wars of the Roses included 3 regional uprisings in 1450, 1489, and 1497, countless private feuds, murders, ambushes, skirmishes, and sieges, and 13 full-scale battles, with the clashes of 1461, 1471, 1485, and 1487 proving truly decisive. At least 10 coups or attempted coups shook the realm, while 15 invasions, notably in 1461, 1470, 1471, 1483, and 1485, kept the kingdom on edge. 5 monarchs, Henry VI, Edward IV, Edward V, Richard III, and Henry VII, reigned across 7 successions, ushering in no fewer than 5 dynastic turnovers between 1461 and 1485. Though swords and sieges defined much of the era, the real battleground was often the royal court. Leaders of the House of York included Richard the Duke of York, Edward IV, and Richard III, while the Lancastrian leaders were Henry VI, his formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou, and ultimately Henry VII. The reigning monarch, King Henry VI, sought to bring the 100 Years' War with France to a peaceful end. During the reign of his father, Henry V, England made advances in the war, and Henry V was admired by his English subjects as a strong leader. On the other hand, under the reign of Henry VI, the French retook much of the territory previously lost to the English. Escalating war expenses, compounded by the lingering effects of the bubonic plague pandemic and an increasing competition in trade, created an economic downturn that had devastating impacts throughout England. Not only were the common people of England broke, but the government of King Henry VI was on the verge of bankruptcy. The people divided into factions, each blaming others for their problems. Struggling country squires resented wealthy businessmen for buying up their cheap land. Native-born merchants accused foreign-born merchants of engaging in shady business practices that contributed to inflation and trade deficits, and everyone believed that the government was filled with corrupt administrators. An atmosphere of insurgency swept across England and extended into Ireland. Margaret of Anjou and William, the Duke of Suffolk, convinced King Henry VI to appoint Richard, the Duke of York, as governor of Ireland. The Duke of York was Henry's main rival to the throne, and the king's advisers believed that the appointment would not only remove the Duke from London, but would also give him the impossible task of subduing the rebellion in Ireland and thereby undermine his credibility. The monarchy faced potential revolution not only from the impoverished, but also from community leaders, business owners, and landholders. Initially, the rebels did not question the authority of King Henry or the legitimacy of the monarchical style of government. Instead, they directed their grievances at public administrators. The English were frustrated by their weakened international power and primarily blamed William, the Duke of Suffolk, the principal advisor to the king. In January of 1450, Parliament convened to address the debts of the Crown, and on February the 7th, the House of Commons impeached Suffolk for treason. Anticipating that King Henry VI would acquit Suffolk of the deadly crime of treason, they later added lesser charges involving misuse of government funds, inappropriate appointment of officials, obstructing the execution of the laws, and screening offenders from justice. As expected, the king rejected the charge of treason, but sentenced Suffolk to live in France for a term of 5 years on the remaining charges. As Suffolk sailed for France, his ship was intercepted by a cruiser with a crew of English rebels who captured and beheaded him. Also in January of that same year, Adam Molins, who was an English bishop, a royal administrator, and a friend of the Duke of Suffolk, was murdered by unpaid soldiers. In June, William Ayscough, who served as a royal advisor and was the bishop who officiated at the wedding of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was killed by an angry mob. In London, the rebellion was led by a man who went by the name Jack Cade. Like most rebel leaders, Cade had both supporters and detractors. Some believed that he was driven by a sincere desire for better government and improved living conditions, and one supporter described him as follows.
At a time when England was afflicted by the rule of a weak king and an ambitious queen, torn by the factions of nobles in power, and generally distressed by the wholesale bribery and corruption of all public officials, the common people, led by Cade, struck a blow, and struck hard, for the better government of the Commonwealth. The rising was the work of strong, courageous men who, when king, nobles and judges were failing lamentably to guide the destinies of England, did their best to call these evil counsellors to account. Cade gave his life in the cause of good government, as a brave man should, and disgrace has been heaped upon his good name, which is the common fate of reformers and revolutionaries in all ages.
Conversely, his critics viewed Cade as a self-serving manipulator who spoke of change, but lacked any real plans for improving the government. They portrayed him as a deceiver who misled his wretched and unfortunate followers into believing that the educated and wealthy should be brought down, and that only he should speak for England. They even claimed that he suggested it should be a crime to drink beer in small glasses. While these ideas might have resonated with the rabble mobs that supported Cade, his detractors ultimately dismissed them as nothing more than foolish fantasies and empty promises. The true identity of Jack Cade remains a mystery, just as it was during his lifetime. The name Jack Cade was likely a pseudonym he adopted to conceal his real identity. He also went by the name John Mortimer, which led King Henry VI to believe that Cade was a relative and supporter of the Duke of York, as Mortimer was a family name on the Duke's mother's side. The list of grievances compiled by Cade and his followers were broad enough to include concerns affecting every economic and social class in London. They alleged that the poor were being overtaxed, while the wealthy received exemptions from tax laws. Furthermore, they were upset that their tax money was being used to support the lavish lifestyle of the Queen and her favorites rather than to sustain the king and his nation. They disagreed with the king's pardon of the Duke of Suffolk for treason, but they wanted it known that they were not responsible for the Duke's death. They accused the king's administrators of perverting justice, rigging elections, destroying the economy, and weakening the military. They wanted the king to remove his corrupt and inept advisers and replace them with the Duke of York and his allies. When the king failed to respond to their complaints, Cade and an estimated 4,000 armed rebels gathered south of London in an area known as Blackheath. The king dispatched a small delegation to offer pardons to the rebels if they would disperse. The rebels rejected the offer, and the next day the king sent a large military force to confront them. However, when the soldiers arrived, they discovered that the rebels had departed under the cover of the darkness the previous night. Rather than pursuing the rebels with the entire force, King Henry VI sent a small contingency to monitor their movements. Cade and his men became aware of the contingency force, and a fight ensued. The leaders of the contingency, Sir Humphrey Stafford and his cousin William Stafford, along with approximately 40 of the king's soldiers, were killed. In July of 1450, Cade and the rebels re-entered London and began to hold tribunals where they convicted and beheaded public officials whom they accused of corruption. While in the city, the rebels, including Cade, were fueled by adrenaline and alcohol. Unable to limit their activities to bettering the government and improving living conditions, they pillaged local businesses and robbed local citizens. This behavior turned the sentiment of the mass population against the rebels. After Cade and his men were ejected from London, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York negotiated a pardon for the rebels if they would disband. The name on the pardon was John Mortimer, causing Cade to question its intimation and validity. Although many of his followers accepted the pardon, he and the remaining insurgents continued the attacks. On 12 July, the king's men, potentially including Sir Robert Washington, captured Cade, and he died from injuries before standing trial. Still believing that Richard, the Duke of York, was responsible for instigating the rebellions, King Henry VI notified sheriffs in coastal areas to oppose the Duke should he try to leave Ireland and enter England. Richard, proclaiming that he had done nothing to deserve such treatment, used the opportunity to raise an army for his own protection. Notwithstanding the orders of the king, Richard managed to cross from Ireland into England and retreated into Wales, where he held a conference with his supporters. During this time, they sent a petition to Henry VI reminding him that his subjects were discontent with his leadership and demanding that he remove corrupt officials from government. They specifically named the Duke of Somerset as one who should be brought to justice for his traitorous actions. Somerset, who had replaced the Duke of Suffolk as Henry's chief advisor, was the main advocate for pursuing peace with France. In King Henry's reply, he assured the Duke of York that he would publish a resolution to end the abuses of his government, that he would choose wise and virtuous counsellors, including the Duke of York, that all traitors would be punished for their crimes in accordance with the mature deliberations of the proper authorities, and that the Duke of Somerset would be made to answer any accusations charged against him. The king imprisoned Somerset briefly, but on the whole failed to follow through with his promises. In reality, King Henry VI was more interested in studying religion than confronting domestic disputes, foreign policy, or financial matters. As a result, Queen Margaret and the Duke of Somerset exercised de facto control of the government. Meanwhile, Richard continued to build his army. In 1452, Richard, the Duke of York, decided to march for London. The Queen, suspicious of Richard, had already raised an army in the king's name to oppose any potential attacks. Not wanting to give the appearance that he was in open rebellion, Richard avoided contact with the king's army and hoped to reach London without conflict. However, when he came near the city, he found the gates closed and was unable to enter. Consequently, he and his rebel forces camped 12 miles outside the city. The king sent a delegation to inquire about the Duke of York's intentions. Richard responded that he did not intend to renounce his loyalty to the crown, but sought to ensure the removal of all evil counselors to the king. He insisted that if Henry would imprison the Duke of Somerset, he would disband his forces. According to Smollett, Richard believed that Somerset had such influence over the king and queen that they would refuse to send him to prison. Richard would then accuse the Queen of being more loyal to Somerset than to her subjects, thereby strengthening the sentiment against the king and plunging the nation into a civil war. Richard would then emerge as the protector of the people. King Henry VI agreed to imprison Somerset in the Tower of London, thus forcing York to disband his army. Once again, however, Henry failed to follow through with his promise, and the Duke of York continued to build an opposing coalition. In 1453, the French decisively defeated the English at the Battle of Castellan in southwestern France. This would mark the end of the 100 Years' War between Britain and France and signal the beginning of open conflict in the Wars of the Roses. We will continue with the story of the Wars of the Roses in next week's episode of The Adventures of George Washington. Thank you for watching. If you found the content useful or entertaining, please subscribe. See this video's description for a complete list of references. We look forward to being with you again in the next episode. I have been your host, Professor Worthington.